Huh?
Yeah. Starting. Okay. Start. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Please be seated. Okay. We now resume with the sixth session titled Hits and Misses, Interests and Ideals in Foreign Policy. We have Maruf Raza as the chair and the speakers TCA Raghavan, Shakti Sinha, Fredrik Erixon, and Sanjay Pulipaka. Maruf Raza, over to you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm obviously honored to be sharing the same table with so many eminences. And I'm also conscious of my limitations that I have been asked to chair. I would rather say I'm the moderator because I think there are people here of considerable excellence and achievement. And they are the ones who are going to really define some of the key issues that we should be looking at in this session. I just want to raise 5 or 6 points, and I'm sure our speakers are going to talk about it. The first is national interest is often taken as the baseline in foreign policy. And those leaders who wish to and have often stood up to ethics or values in foreign policy, will they be willing to go against national interest? And that's a question I think we need to think about. The second is, while interventions in the recent past militarily have been justified on moral, ethical, or idealistic grounds, Kosovo, Serbia is case in point, Iraq is another case in point, Afghanistan again. But the fact is that once you intervene in a situation, whatever your moral standing, are you able to control the flow of events and still get your enforcing force and officials to follow that same moral line? Because it's one thing to sort of stand in a pedestal and make a point, and the other is to see whether it gets implemented. The third is, do your goals only define how you need to achieve them and abandon morals, ethics, and idealistic stands? Or can you still achieve goals by adhering to that? or how much is that now purely a delusionary mirage? The other point is, it is often been said that we must intervene in the interest of others who are persecuted, who are harassed. I mean, the cases of refugees is a case in point. But then there are counter narratives to that is, are they people like us? Should we provide them the same treatment and the same support that we would provide to people like us? Because the definition of your moral or idealistic approach to a problem changes even in your neighborhood when you deal with one set of people vis-a-vis another set of people. Why does that happen? And the emergence of many multinational outfits or agencies, the media is a case in point, often now begin to expose that the moral pontifications or the idealistic stand of politicians is not anywhere near what is being proposed to their own public. So there is often a contradiction between what you say for public consumption and get people to get involved in another country's problems or foreign policy initiatives, and then what you do on the ground. And then how are you able to live with those contradictions as policymakers when they come to haunt you at home? And finally, is it better to expand the discourse of foreign policy to not just issues of interstate relations, but look beyond that into issues where your approach may be the same as your traditional adversary's approach, but collectively you can't do that much about it? The example is of climate change. I mean, that's again an issue of foreign policy, but how do you reconcile that with your national interest? How do you reconcile that with your public interest? A nation's response to armed conflicts, particularly where the histories and the positional stand of your adversaries are so diametrically opposite of each other, that how is it you can sustain that in arguments in international forums that you were more idealistic or ethical than somebody else? I think we have a panel here which is going to wisen us, and I'll just follow this sequence. And may I ask the very distinguished Ambassador Raghavan, our former High Commissioner to Pakistan, and now with the ICWA, keeping time in mind, may I request each panelist to speak for about 10-12 minutes, so we have enough time for question and answers so that I can finish spot on time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maruf, and very grateful to Ambassador Srinivasan and to Dr. Sanjay Pulipaka for inviting me to this conference. And for the past, since yesterday, I've been listening with a great deal of attention to these different perspectives on European values, ASEAN values, Chinese values, and Japanese values. And I'll try to put together some of my own responses vis-a-vis some of the points Maruf raised in his introduction. But let me begin by saying that there was a book I read a long time ago by Eric Hobsbawm when he talks about the short 20th century and how it ended in 1991. And basically what he said was, in 1991, one particular Enlightenment idea, which is liberal capitalism, triumphed over another, which was communism. Now, was there a short 20th century which extended from 1914 to 1991? Certainly, perhaps from a Western perspective, it was a short 20th century. But I wonder sometimes, from an Indian perspective, perhaps even from perspectives of others in Asia, was the 20th century actually shorter? Certainly I would see, rather than 1914, perhaps 1919 is a more appropriate beginning for the 20th century. 1919, you have major anti-colonial upsurges in India, in China, in Egypt, even in Korea, but in Korea, of course, against Japan. It really marked the change of a balance or a change of a mindset with regard to the imperial presence in these countries. And then why 1989 or 1991? Very obviously, 1991 is when, and in Eric Hobsbawm's words, the world that went to pieces at the end of the 1980s was the world shaped by the impact of the Russian Revolution in 1917. So it was the triumph of liberal democracy, Western capitalism over Soviet socialism. It was also the end of the Cold War. It was the coming down of the Berlin Wall. And yesterday, Professor James Mayall referred to this great sense of Western triumphalism, the missionary enthusiasm for the liberal project. All of these were forces very much visible in 1991. But if one stands back, and again, as I said, see it from an Indian perspective, perhaps there are other years. And I would say that 20th century perhaps ended even earlier. And why not look at 1979? Why 1979? 1979 is the year of revolution in Iran, where you have a totally different perspective from that of Enlightenment values coming to the top. It is the year of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Again, a major entry by a world power into the politics of South Asia. And since then, South Asia has lived with world powers within, and I'll come to that a little later. But it's also the year of the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, where the forces of democracy in Pakistan receive a setback from which they are yet to recover. There are various other changes. You have the beginning of modernization in China and Chinese military modernization, economic modernization, and finally, how the United States was very much part of that modernization process in China, because China and United States established diplomatic relations on the 1st of January 1979. So I would think that in many ways the forces we deal with today were born in 1979 when you see it from an Indian perspective. But I want to turn to this point about the entry of great powers into South Asia. It began with the Soviet Union, continued by the United States post 9/11. But I think for us in India, the important point is the presence of China and the expanding footprint of China in South Asia. The Indian foreign policy mindset was tutored, at least this was my experience when I joined service, that for great powers in South Asia is fundamentally against our interest. And we have to do what we can to keep them out, which explains our discomfort with the Soviet entry into Afghanistan, but nevertheless, because it was in our interest in overall terms, we went with it. Similarly, the US presence in Afghanistan and what it meant to Iran and the rest of the region, there were certain negative points for us, but overall it was in our interest, but we went with it. But nevertheless, the sentiment remained that we have to keep great powers out of our region. It is not in the region's interest, and it is not in India's interest. I think now we face a different situation, and it's a qualitatively different situation, because we have, in the form of China, not a great power from outside intervening in our region, but a great power within our region, and in many ways from the region. And this requires a certain change in how we look at our neighbors, especially in South Asia. Maruf raised the point about how do we, is intervention for the public good in some cases justified? And certainly I think when we look at South Asia and India, we've always had a certain fascination for our own constitutional values, and the values in particular with regard to Indian federalism and Indian diversity. And in many cases, these were a template which we offered to our neighbors. We did it, for instance, in the 1980s to Sri Lanka, that the way out for your internal issues is to see whether the Indian constitution, the federal principles offer a template for you to adopt into your own constitution. We did it again in Nepal in 2016 and 2017. And certainly I think that was our default mode when we faced a situation where there were the possibilities of foreign, of external powers being active in our neighborhood. Our constitutional features seem to offer a template for them as a way out rather than dragging in great powers into their internal politics. It's not as if we followed this principle consistently, where there was no real danger of great power or external power intervention. We were not really too much concerned about what was happening internally in many of our neighbors. For instance, in Bhutan, vis-a-vis the migration of large number of Nepalese into Bhutan, it was left for the Bhutanese to sort out as they wished. Similarly, with regard to minorities in Bangladesh, it was not seen as something which would make or break issue in India-Bangladesh relations. But in other cases where there was the risk of great power or the possibility of great power presence expanding, our constitutional templates seem to offer something which we could suggest to our neighbors. I think with the rise of China in South Asia, that phase has come to an end. And we cannot use the constitutional values to which we give so much importance in terms of federalism and diversity. We cannot offer that as a template to our neighbors. And this is the big change which I think has occurred, and in many ways is related, as I said, to what happened in 1979. The third point I wish to make again was related to, I think Maruf referred to it, but also was part of the title of this session, which is hits and misses. I think in South Asia we saw two big hits and misses. One was in Afghanistan between 2002, 2003, and 2010, which was again a failure of the Enlightenment mission in Afghanistan. Much like the Soviet intervention from 1979 was a failure of another kind of an Enlightenment intervention. So in Afghanistan, that was one big hit where it appeared that an Enlightenment intervention may change the situation in Afghanistan and the relationship with its neighbors. But clearly that Enlightenment intervention failed, and it failed in the face not of another universalist ideology, but it faced in the face of internal Afghan disunity. I think the second big hit and miss was between India and Pakistan, and particularly within Pakistan between 2004 and again between 2004 and 2008, 2009. When one looks back, I think it was the application of a kind of an Enlightenment perspective to India-Pakistan relations, that if you expand cultural contacts, if you expand economic relations, there is a possibility that the pattern of relations set in the past will break, that pattern will change. In fact, that did not happen. And therefore, you have a reversion to an older cycle in which interventions drawn from values of the Enlightenment, which is expand trade, expand people-to-people relations, learn from each other's internal processes, etc., that clearly has run into very major roadblocks. And again, the reason is not some major universal ideology, but the reason is internal change in Pakistan itself, and we can discuss that later. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I think we are keeping to time, 15 minutes, but that's okay. Professor Sakti Sinha, head of the Nehru Center, and the Nehru Library, and eminent author and policy maker, though quietly so and not as loud as many others. May I have your views, sir?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Ambassador Srinivasan and Sanjay for the invitation, and the opportunity, and the privilege to be speaking here. TCA, just on a diversion, 1979 is one date, arguably, 91 obviously, 2008 is the third date when the 20th century could say to have ended. Because then the age of uncertainty really starts, but that's another argument. I really like this sentence from the paper circulated to us, and I'll quote it, quote, "Neither camp has a monopoly on wisdom, nothing is absolute, everything is relative," unquote. We in India are very comfortable with ambiguity and extremely uncomfortable with rigidity, which is why when Ambassador Krishnan Rana wanted, why don't you have white papers? It's precisely for this reason that we are not very comfortable with white papers. In other words, what we accept basically is a balance between values and self-interest. And Dr. Chaudhary, you mentioned the other day, yesterday, this continuum between idealism and realism. It's not really a contradiction in that sense, but somewhere down the line, where I disagree is putting Chanakya in the realm of the realist. No, Chanakya was very much of the Niti philosophy, so he was somewhere straddling realism and idealism. As we discussed in the morning session, largely the discourse on values has been dominated by this alleged dichotomy between Asian values and Western values. What is universal values? Well, as Krishnan at the end said, we can keep on debating it. The question really is whether Indian approach to international politics has it been guided by Indian ethos or Indian experiences or not. Now, I understand and I agree completely that Indian experience, Indian ethos, there's nothing single, no single variant of it. And I would broadly be discussing it from a very different angle as normally spoken in these circles. I mean, morning, two people said that if I speak will upset other people. This may not upset you, but it will be quite different, which is from the viewpoint of what I call Indian conservatism. Now, before moving on to examine this linkage between conservatism and decision-making, an important question to ask is, do these principles of Indian conservatism influence Indian foreign policy decision-making at all? Now, if you look at the early years of India's independence and subsequently, our leaders were none of them identified themselves as conservative. Conservative remains in India a dirty word, but that's a larger angle. I will not go into that. Why is it a dirty word? On the contrary, they were far more comfortable with labels like liberal or left of center. And now we have this new phenomena called the left liberal. Fundamentally, to me, liberals and left are quite different, are quite contradictory, but leave it aside, now we call them left liberals. But the fact is that we are located in a larger cultural context, and we do engage with all kinds of our traditions, our beliefs, our arguments, and different persuasions are comfortably live with each other, survive with each other. Is it possible then to say that the Indian leaders in power have been impacted indirectly by our experiences and by our thinking, most of which Indian thinking is in some sense, not in the sense of conservatism as understood in the West today, but in our own sense of conservatism as something where you don't change things very abruptly, where you value your traditions, but you're not bound by them all the time. I'll leave it aside. I have no details there. To me, yes, they are influenced about it. Why I call this Indian conservatism is that it's neither about the individual completely, nor is it about the community completely. It's trying to find a balance between the individual and the community. How do you strike a balance? And if you're trying to strike this balance, does it have an implications for foreign policy? One, India has always refrained from, quote unquote, exporting any kind of political model, not even any kind of economic model to the countries before, during, whatever, for the last 60, 70 years. We're extremely uncomfortable, and therefore, after 91, when we were asked to help promote democracy, the Indian government was very hesitant about that. In trying to maintain this whole thing, I mean, therefore, as I said, we are uncomfortable with pushing democracy at all cost, which was the feature. We have a saying in India, it's a very old saying, it's a very important principle. The saying goes, ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti. In other words, the truth is one, the wise see it differently. In other words, your path is valid for you, my path is valid for me. I respect your truth, I don't doubt your truth, I don't even question your truth. To bolster it, we have another concept, which sounds different but actually is limited to it. It says in Sanskrit, Anno bhadra kritavo yanti vishvata, which means let noble thoughts come from all sides. So I'm open to influences from all sides. Gandhi went forward and said, I want influences from all sides, but I won't get swept away by it. In other words, I'll accept such of those thoughts that in my context are relevant to me. And therefore, the lines from your paper which says nobody has a monopoly of truth. As I said, the end result is that we do not like exporting or importing models. We also have grave concerns about this breakdown of communities. If you're pushing individual rights to the extent that it breaks down communities, we feel it could be a remedy for disaster in the short term because of abruptness. We don't doubt the need for individual liberty. Our constitution is very strong on it, but we feel that it's not something which can be done. So on one hand, we don't push models. On the other hand, we are willing to give technical assistance to Election Commission, through others, in strengthening democratic processes, in strengthening state building, whether in Afghanistan or Myanmar or other places. Of course, there are clear instances when India has, obviously, like a country living in this world in the present times, advocated one or the other, or as Ravi pointed out, taken actions one or the other way around. However, when you see a situation like Libya or Syria, we were extremely uncomfortable with what was happening. We were getting worried about this business of regime change and about imposing systems, which, as you know, what has happened. On global governance, we obviously feel that the global governance frameworks, hangover of World War II, example Bretton Woods, and of course the United Nations, are not equitable. We do want a more equitable global framework. One, because we like equity, and two, because we also feel it should reflect changing realities. So again, we're trying to balance out between the ideals of equity and the realities of changing global weights. But we do not believe remotely on dismantling it. So we are not revisionist. We know we like incremental change. And therefore, even if our per capita income and our GDP later this year will become the 5th largest economy in the world in terms of not purchasing power, but actual exchange rates. And yet we don't feel that that is a good enough reason to go about stepping on toes and rejecting frameworks that we've signed on to, which we benefit from, just because it doesn't suit us at a particular moment of time. The Indo-Bangladesh arbitration, same as the South China Sea, when the final judgment went considerably against what India had argued for, we very quietly accepted it. There was not a murmur of protest about it. Does it reflect on our external economic engagement? I would argue for yes. Yes, we believe markets are efficient, but we do not believe that market fundamentalism is the right way out, or what is supposedly said the neoliberal form of the neoliberal or forms. Let me put it differently. We believe that there are things which are beyond the market, whether it's aesthetics, whether it's beliefs, whether it's simple friendship and loyalty, and we don't believe that these can be monetized. Neither do we believe in the socialist model of economy, which we realized after 45 years of trying it out, that it actually really pulled us down, didn't allow us to go. We do believe in external economic engagement with those partners where we feel we have something of value to give. We do extend lines of credit, and unknown to many people, over the last 15 years, we've extended lines of credit close to $30 billion. So however, in very low terms, 2%. And we don't buy off, we don't take over properties just because somebody can't repay the money. So our interventions that demonstrate that we are largely guided by, yes, economic benefits to the community, strengthening relationships, and not about giving them a model of growth or a model which we feel is good for them. If you want us to help build a port, fine with that. We will not tell you that we shall come and build a port for you on our own. And therefore, an important component of all this is that now there is some re-examination of our collective memories, some imagination of some engagement with our historical experiences. We do talk a lot about when Prime Minister Modi went to Uzbekistan, he did talk about the Indo-Uzbek cultural links going back to the Mughals and even before that. So it's not just when you go to Southeast Asia, we talk about people from India going and spreading Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam, but we also do that with Central Asia as an example. And it was an Indian pilot who brought Vasco da Gama from Zanzibar to India, Majid. So we do believe that we've had engaged with this part of the world for a very, very long time, and that we can continue to do so, but again in a low-key manner, not in a prescriptive manner. But of course, there have been lots of hits and misses. Living up to your ideals is one thing. The realities of the world, sometimes it does amount to break down to cynicism. But how do you move, I think, a balance towards really finding the balance between ideals and realism, between the individual and the community? We tend to refer to Kautilya's mandala theory very well, but we refer to it in isolation. Mandala, concentric circles, first circle your friends, second circle your enemies, third circle your friends, because friends is an enemy, etc. It's a very limited way of looking at it, because mandala is inconceivable before Saptang, or the seventh Prakriti, where 2,500 years ago, we defined national power, state power, where the king is only one component of it. The economy is there, the people are there, the administration is there, the armed forces are there. So it's a very holistic way of looking at it. Most Indians are aware of what we call the four upayas, Sam, Dana, Bhed, Danda. What we don't understand is that this is actually a hierarchy where you first talk conciliation. When that fails, gifting. When that fails, you do dissension, and you come to war as a last option only. We have other prescriptions of dealing with foreign powers through Sadgunya. We have not been able to really actualize it, I think, to our disadvantage, where it tells you what will apply in what circumstances. They are very preliminary. I can go on, but I think I'll not go into the details of all that. I think just to raise these points, and I've done it in 12 minutes, Maruf. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sinha Saab. May I now invite Fredrik, Erixon, and I'm sure your perspective will be a bit different, if not completely different, on a lot of issues, at least the examples that you will give us, which will be perhaps from the European Western experience as much as our examples as yet has been more subcontinental.
Thank you very much, and thank you indeed for adding those cautionary notes to what I'm going to say. When I was invited to this panel, I did find the title to be attractingly vague. But when I was listening to the first two speakers doing excellent presentations on developments in this part of the world, I thought my contribution can easily be accused of being a bit Eurocentric, because not because I'm going to try to impose a European view on developments in other countries, but because I'm preoccupied by developments in Europe. Partly because I think in tandem with the gradual withdrawal from international collaboration and leadership by the United States of America, one of the other significant trends that we're seeing right now is the progressive decline of Europe as an international partner, the progressive decline of Europe in terms of having an interest in what is going on in other parts of the world and devising a policy which is attendant to those particular developments. I'd like to make 3 points. I'm going to start off a little bit on foreign policy and gradually move to Europe itself. My first point is about what's probably been many experiences in this part of the world throughout decades, if not centuries, which is that Europe, of course, and European leaders, European governments have been pretty generous in sharing the particular views of what other countries should do. That there has been a very strong element in European foreign policy that they want to remake other countries in their own image. And that has come through imperialism, and it's come perhaps more recently through the notion that the model of collaboration that has developed in the post-war period in Europe should be replicated in other parts of the world. That the founding ethos that the institutions created in order to attend to that ethos are both something that we should see much more of in other parts of the world. Europe is also suffering from what you can, by a psychological term, call the diminishing giant syndrome, in the sense that the less powerful it has become in the rest of the world, the more intent on sharing its prescriptive views of what other countries should do has grown. That we're now seeing European leaders, either from European Union institutions or from European governments, having pretty profound ideas about matters that you can call the habits of the heart. They're not really connected to the broad model of foreign policy or foreign economic policy that we've seen from Europe in the past. They are much more about the intention of trying to remake not other countries but other individuals to become more like Europeans. And there is an interesting part here, because the less powerful that Europe has become, the more we've seen this tendency to lecture others about what their habits of the heart should be. I think this is partly a consequence of European collaboration itself, and I'd like to say a few words on the basis of values and interests and how they have interplayed with each other in the creation of what we now call the European Union, and perhaps point to one of the missing elements when we talk about broad motivations or broad factors in international political collaboration, which is the role of institutions. The EU itself has often been called a postmodern construction, and I think that is correct in the sense that it starts from a viewpoint that there is something wrong with the classic conception of the state and the classic conception of modernism. There are good reasons for why this took hold in Europe, and those reasons, of course, are about wars and the fact that we've seen 2 wars ravaging the entire continent in Europe. And the classic conception of state, of course, starts with a territorial definition. It starts with having significance, if not sanctity, connected to the concept of borders, the concept that we have separations between countries that are significant and leads to different conceptions about what constitute an interest for those people or those institutions that occupy the territory inside a border. The EU has been in the business of playing down the significance and sanctity of borders. It's been in the business of trying to take away concepts of national interests inside the European Union. And as a consequence of that, we have seen remarkable developments over the past 70, 80 years with peace, creation of prosperity, and a gradually sort of expanding idea of what constitutes Europe itself. For instance, that we've had an expansion of the membership in the European Union, which also now include many of the countries that previously were Soviet satellite states and now broadly conform to the liberal principles and liberal values of democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, and the market economy. So in that sense, I think we can start with making a first historical point, which is a hit rather than a miss. And I think that point is about the successes in Europe of achieving many of its liberal values through the creation of what we call the European project or the European Union itself. And that is probably one of the big foreign policy hits that we've seen in Europe over the past couple of decades. It's much more about its internal development rather than what represents Europe abroad or how Europe behaves in either international institutions or directly against other governments. The big hit is about the development in the European continent itself. My second point is going to contrast on the first point in the sense that I believe most of those Europeans who think about the development in Europe and what's going to happen in Europe believe that we are in an awkward situation right now. If we start by looking at European policy vis-a-vis other countries or other institutions in the world, I think we have to draw the same conclusion as we heard in the previous session from, I think he has left now, where he complained about the absence of strategy or real strategy in Indian thinking, or that there are lots of experts on strategy, but very few tend to have a very grounded view on what actually constitutes strategy and how it can be delivered. Europe is awkward because it finds that one of the most dominating sources for content as well as the form of European collaboration is withdrawing from the world, and that's the United States. I don't think it's possible to exaggerate the importance of the US for the cooperation project that we've had in Europe since the Second World War, starting with United States leadership after the war, through the Marshall Plan, through the creation of many different institutions that were incredibly important in order to get Europe to the point where it started to collaborate much more intensively with each other. But we've also seen it much more recently that the presence of America has been a foundational source in trying to bring warring European governments together in order to formulate a common view on many pressing issues. Europe, of course, have had a not entirely relaxed relationship with the United States. It's been clearly the junior partner in the transatlantic firm and been reluctantly accepting that position. We have seen Europe to be the source where many academics, politicians, and others have been pointing out the hypocrisies of American policy. But at the end of the day, I think most people have conformed to the notion that American leadership has been much more benign than what any of the alternatives would be, and therefore that Europe largely has been supportive of many of the grand American strategies that we've seen over the past couple of decades. Europe is also in an awkward position because many of the multilateral institutions that it cares about are floundering. And that we can talk about United Nations. I think my example would be the World Trade Organization, an institution that haven't been able to deliver a global trade agreement since 1994. An institution that clearly is now on the rocks, and we're talking about perhaps months before we're going to see a radical decline in the vitality and integrity of these institutions as the entire dispute settlement mechanism is about to be breaking down. If we talk about China and India and Europe's position towards China and India, I think we have to put question marks on these two issues. I don't think anyone knows what's the grand strategy or what's the aspiration at all is in Europe for what type of relation we're going to have to China and India in the future. We see that the Eastern Partnership idea that many European governments and European Union institutions had just a few years ago is collapsing. And in its absence, we're not seeing any new coherent idea for what our relations, not just going to be not just with Russia, but with many of the Eastern Partnership countries that we had strong ideas for what we wanted to achieve just a few years ago. EU-Mediterranean, the same thing there. Until a few years ago, we had pretty grand aspirations of what we wanted to achieve as Europe with many of the Mediterranean countries. Now we're basically down to a policy of trying to police our borders as much as possible to avoid migrants to arrive here in Europe. And we are talking about bribing North African countries in order to establish what we called disembarkation platforms in order to provide us with an opportunity to return migrants that have arrived in Europe to these countries. The awkward situation also comes from the fact that we have several members of the European Union that are on a different political trajectory now. They are not on a development where they are increasingly conforming to the values and the norms that constituted the European project. And consequently, we have had difficulties in trying to come up with ideas for what are we going to do in order to manage or address the situation with increasing value divergence and increasing interest and strategic divergence in European Union. There is, for instance, no European strategy for what we want to have as relation with Great Britain in the future. And in the absence of having that particular strategy, we sort of try to come up with strategies for being the best negotiators or being the entity that can manage negotiations with the best logistical capacities. And when you confront then with such a disorganized government as we have in the UK right now, it basically means that we're going to end up with an agreement that is going to be very much attending to those particular instincts that drove European ambitions here. So, you know, we've been negotiating this withdrawal agreement with the UK, which centered on three priorities. One was on finance and dealing with contributions to the EU budget. Another one concerned the rights and status of European citizens in the UK and vice versa. And the third concerned developments in Ireland between the north and the south. The first two issues were obviously part of what is a normal priority for Europe when it deals with Britain, because these are part of the European treaties. The third one is not, and it's the issue that now caused a lot of friction, of course, for the UK, that we have a very prescriptive idea of what the relation should be between North and South Ireland in the future. My point here is basically, in the absence of having a bigger strategy on the part of the European Union, we easily end up with other interests, defining what those components should be in the policy that we pursue. Thirdly and lastly, I'm going to do this very quickly. I think we're seeing now a situation where the foundations of the European Union are shaking itself, and we have several people, including myself, asking questions about whether it's possible for the EU to survive at all in the future we're seeing. We're seeing two groups that, in my view, have stress points that may take them out of the European Union in the medium to long-term future. One group is Euro countries, and they are defined by countries that have severe economic problems and severe problems of conforming to what is sort of a German hard currency idea of the European economy. So countries like Italy and Greece are on a course which is clearly diverging from this sort of the center of the euro. Another group is constituted by the Eastern European countries that find issues of identity becoming far more important in the definition of what their countries should represent, and they are increasingly on collision course with European Union institutions. What I find perhaps more interesting is that between those two groups, we have a general development in Europe, which is represented more by the center, represented far more by non-extreme thinking, which is going in a direction of gradual withdrawal from international obligations, not just outside Europe, but also inside Europe. That we have, to conclude, and to sort of not step into other things I wanted to say here, but to conclude that we have sort of a general political culture right now which almost resembles the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings, if you have seen the movies or read the books, which is that Europeans who wants to have a quiet life, Europeans who doesn't want to be exposed to grander issues which force them to have a view on different things. And those that had to leave the Shire, those that went on big adventures, like for instance, destroying the foundational ring. Once that's done, they want to leave Earth and to join heaven. And I think this is, to conclude my point, which is that what we're seeing is a gradual withdrawal of European interest for what happens outside its own borders, a European development where we have a rediscovery of more classic conceptions about nations and states, and as a consequence of that, they tend to care far less about developments outside their borders. Thank you.
Okay, now we have the benefit of 5 minutes extra added to our session because I'm told Sri Ram Madhav is running a bit late. So, but that doesn't allow our last speaker, who's the author of a book, jointly the author of a book on values in foreign policy, Sanjay Pulipaka, very much more time than our other speakers, but so that we can open this forum out, please. So your 12 minutes plus minus.
Much less than that. Thank you. When we think of hits and misses, I was wondering, why do we think with reference to national interests and values? Why can't two values be in contest? That's one of the questions I have. And when Maruf was talking about national interests, can some values do constitute in themselves a national interest? That's an important question that we also need to reflect upon. And one of the things that we are seeing in the subcontinent is the contest between two sets of values. One is self-determination and other is respect for diversity. What is self-determination? It is the right of people to have their own nation state. When can a group of people secede under the right of self-determination? One, when there is cultural distinctiveness broadly. But when cultural distinctiveness changes every 100 kilometers in the subcontinental context, and where there are significant cultural overlaps, can a group of people say that they have a right to self-determination? That's an important question. Then what about minorities, living within minorities? That is another important question that we also need to reflect upon. If it is cultural distinctiveness, then the other issue that would come is cultural oppression and economic exploitation. If a group is being subjected to cultural oppression and economic exploitation, then right to self-determination will come into play. But creation of nation states, separate nation states, need not be the only solution. There can be many autonomous mechanisms. The other dimension is that you have problem with one nation state, so therefore you are creating another nation state. So it's not an imaginative response to the challenges that are there. In multicultural societies, further, there are many narratives of exploitation and oppression. So where do we start this whole discussion? Then there are other challenges when we think of right to self-determination, that is in terms of modalities of operationalizing self-determination. A referendum, I mean, that's the most challenging thing because it may result in majoritarian tendencies. So when we see a contest between two values like this, where respect for diversity and self-determination are clashing, that is where the challenges in the subcontinent are, and that is where I think we should locate our hits and misses. So nothing is a hit or a miss, but it is also a contestation of values. The other dimension is one of the hits in the Indian foreign policy that has gone unnoticed a little bit is in terms of development assistance. As India is emerging as a major power, we have a significant development assistance program that is going on. Almost a few $1 billion is being spent on development assistance. Then should development assistance be guided by, what are the parameters that define development assistance? One is national interest. The other is, of course, it should also be defined by the values, certain values. And what are those values? In the context of India, since we respect diversity and equity, there is a demand that our development assistance should also be defined by diversity and equity. If you look at Indian subcontinent and other places where we are doing development assistance, they are marked by remarkable hierarchies, social divides, such as religious, race, and hill versus plains, as in one of our neighboring countries. So if you are giving development assistance, it should not accentuate hierarchies and discrimination, and it should be respect the value of diversity. Respecting the value of diversity becomes important. A good procedural innovation was made, which was called the small development programs. Instead of doing big projects, we are doing small different projects which will cover various ethnic groups in a given country. That will ensure the respect for diversity when India is giving development assistance. We are doing it in Nepal, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and other places. What is the design and implementation mechanism? Significant local participation. There is an MOU, and then everything will be done at the local level. Why? Because central level governments are controlled by certain ethnic groups, local authorities are controlled by certain ethnic groups, so you can ensure the respect for diversity. But then there is a lot of criticism on that as well, that the central governments are claiming that you are not being inclusive of all stakeholders, whereas the local people are saying don't involve the central government because it will result in their domination. They're already controlling the administrative state apparatus. So how do you resolve this conflict between respect for diversity on one hand and respect for inclusivity of involving all stakeholders in another country? That's a significant challenge that we are facing in the development assistance with reference to values. The other is democracy, promotion, and stability. As an emerging power, India has often been critiqued for not promoting democracy sufficiently. There are two sets of issues here. One is that there are multiple stakeholders in a country, and one of the stakeholders wants India to intervene on its behalf under the garb of principles like federalism or some other thing. And if India intervenes, we become an interventionist power. If we don't intervene, then we become a power that is abdicating democratic principles in foreign policy. So that's a challenge that we are dealing with. Western countries sometimes critique us for not promoting democracy the way they want us to promote democracy. Example is Myanmar. They want a Big Bang approach. We are not comfortable with that kind of promotion of values. India has a different democracy promotion approach. There is a discomfort with an event-based Big Bang approach. We are more interested in institutional frameworks and developing capacities. We have done that in Myanmar and other places in a sustained manner. So if there is if people are critiquing us for a missing democracy promotion in neighborhood, it is also because of the way we approach democracy promotion with a different set of value frameworks. Then there is a need for, as Maruf was pointing out in one of his very interesting set of questions, is how do you intervene in persecution is happening? And one of the examples that we had recently was in Myanmar. Sometimes transition countries have multiple power centers. Myanmar is not a full democracy, it's a semi-democracy. Some people call it semi-authoritarian country. So the democratic forces are in control, are calling for withdrawal of military from various segments of decision making. Whereas military is trying to retain power in Myanmar. Our understanding of the recent sectarian violence, essentially Rohingya conflict, should be located in the above power contestations. The Rohingya humanitarian crisis has benefited military. How? It has pushed the debate on democratization into the background, and the military has now emerged as a popular institution. It is important to condemn the occurrence of mass violence, but it has a lot of questions. Should we focus on individuals like Suu Kyi, or should we focus on institutions like military in our condemnations? Should we sanction Myanmar again, and what would be the implications of sanctions on Myanmar's democratization process? How will it happen? Are we inadvertently strengthening the military by references to sanctions? So how do we respond to that? So if the response to the recent developments in Myanmar is being categorized as a mess, it is also because we are trying to ensure convergence between various values, both short-term and long-term. So what we are seeing quite often in international politics, in India's neighborhood, in India's foreign policy, in my opinion, is also a humble submission, is not merely a contest between national interest and values, but between two different sets of values as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very crisp and obviously a lot of meat in it. I will now request you to ask questions from the panel.